Hello. So in this lecture, we'll talk about Look Back in Anger, the play by Joan Osborne that we'll be covering in this course. So I believe we've already talked about the background of the drama, the background of the play, the cultural condition which produced the play. So today we'll dive right into the text. We'll talk about what happens in the text, who are the main characters, the plot of the drama, and how is it relevant, most importantly, how is it relevant to the context, in a context of gender and literature. In other words, what are the gender complexities in the play? The reason why we are looking at the play in the first place. So Look Back in Anger, as I mentioned in one of my lectures prior to this, is a drama which sort of started off what we now call the angry young man movement, which is about the very discontented, angry, disillusioned young man who is sort of cynical, who was a romantic at one point in time, who had great promises, who had great hopes in the world, but now is increasingly getting cynical and discontented and grumpy and angry with the cultural conditions around him. So as you probably have imagined by now, this is a movement which very quickly crossed boundaries. It came to India, it spilled over into popular mediums such as Bollywood. So if you remember the films in the 1970s and 80s starring Amitabh Bachchan, those were basically an extension of the angry young man movement, which again portrayed this very angry, discontented and disillusioned young man who was very cynical about his location in the world and the cultural condition around him. So Look Back in Anger as a drama was a pioneer in some sense of this angry young man movement. So the protagonist in Look Back in Anger is Jimmy Porter. So he's the first character we will study in this particular lecture, Jimmy Porter. So Jimmy Porter, as we get to know in the play, is a 25-year-old Englishman who has been to university, has a university degree, but is essentially jobless. In other words, he doesn't really have a job which is commensurate to his credentials. So he runs a sweet stall in a market, in an open market, which is not something you expect a university graduate to do. And this immediately tells you something about the cultural condition of the time. So why is, the first question that you should be asking at this point is, why is a university graduate like Jimmy Porter, who has been to university, educated, etc., finding himself running a street stall in an open market? So that immediately tells you something about the political and cultural condition of England at that point of time. So this is an England which, as I suggested, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, is essentially economically emasculated. This is a bankrupt England. This is post-1947. The empire has ended. India is a free country. England is no longer an imperial power. The Second World War had made England bankrupt, etc. So England is no longer, a dominant power in a global scene. The two dominant powers which have replaced England in the global scene are USA and the USSR, America and Russia. So this is also a time which could be seen as the beginning of the Cold War, the war which never really happened, but the war which was always happening in the background, in rhetoric, in political situations, etc. So this is the cultural condition of Look Back in Anger, and as I suggested immediately, the Jimmy Porter is an Englishman who is a university graduate, but essentially he is jobless, or is doing a job which is way beneath him in terms of his credentials. He's running a street stall in a market. So this is the first thing we know about Jimmy Porter. Now, if we look at the play, and I believe you probably by now have acquired the text, you probably have a copy of the play with you, Look Back in Anger. If you don't, please get it as quickly as possible. It's also available online, so you can download it and read it as well. So if you look at the stage directions in Look Back in Anger, the very opening stage directions in Look Back in Anger, you'll find that it's a very graphic and detailed description of the Porter household somewhere in the Midlands, right? So, this is a very typical London, houses run by the government. So this is not really a very posh house. It's not really a very posh neighborhood at all. So this is one of those houses which came up post-1945, post-Second World War, which are now called council houses, right? So these are houses built by the council, the local council, which are inhabited largely by the poor people, the poorer section of the population. So this is what Jimmy Porter does. So it's an old Victorian house, but at the same time, it's got a Victorian architecture about it, but it's very quickly converted into a council house. So again, that tells you something. The conversion of a Victorian house into a council house tells you something about the economic shift, the economic condition of England at that point of time. So it's very quickly converting from a Victorian kind of economy into a more post-Second World War kind of economy, which is essentially bankrupt, impoverished, emasculated in some sense. Right? So this is the house in which the action of Look Back in Anger mostly happens. We hardly see anything outside Look Back in Anger, outside this house in Look Back in Anger. So we get to know what happens elsewhere, outside. But the main action, the main plot of the drama takes place inside this particular house. So it's very important that we study the house in great details as we read the play. So it's got a Victorian architecture, it's got an Edwardian window, but it's essentially a council housing, and this is where Jimmy Porter stays with his wife, Alison Porter, who used to be Alison Redfern, and then interestingly with his friend Cliff Lewis. Now, Cliff is a friend of Jimmy, but he sort of has this very interesting location and look back in anger. So in some sense, he is Jimmy's friend, the male friend of Jimmy, and Jimmy and he share some very intimate moments. They confess to each other, they confide to each other. But in a sense, his relationship with Alison, Jimmy's wife, is very complex. So we could read it as a brotherly relation, a brotherly sisterly relation. They're very fond of each other. It's very affectionate kind of a relationship, but also it's quite intimate. So Alison tells Cliff certain things which she can't bring herself to tell Jimmy, as we will see in the play. So it's a very interesting triangle of human relationship that we find in Look Back in Anger right away. And this is one of the many things which make the play so complex as a drama. So we have Jimmy Porter, the protagonist in Look Back in Anger, living in a council house in Midlands with his wife, Alison Porter, who used to be Alison Redfern, who happens to be the daughter of a colonel, Colonel Redfern, who was stationed in India. So India, again, is a very important presence in Look Back in Anger. It almost becomes a character in Look Back in Anger, as we'll see when you read the play. Because, this is a post-India England, a post-imperial India England. So, in India in Look Back in Anger is a bit of a nostalgic presence. It becomes a signifier of imperial nostalgia, something which was there at one point in time, something which represented or, was a metaphor for abundance, metaphor for, richness, etc., which is now gone. So this is a very, very impoverished England, which can just look back in nostalgia to an imperial India, right? So India, again, is a very important character in Look Back in Anger, and we'll talk about that in more details. But for the moment, it's important for you to understand that this is a post-imperial England. So India enters the scene as a third-person presence, as a territory of desire, as a territory of nostalgia, which was there at one point in time, which is now gone. So Jimmy's wife, Alison Redfern, or Alison Porter, as she is now called, was born in India. So she's a daughter, as I just mentioned, of a colonel who was stationed in India as an imperial officer working for the British Queen. So she grew up entirely in India, and she spent a good part of her childhood and early youth in India, and she came back to England only up in 1947, when India became independent as a state, and where the empire came to an end. So she's again a very complex character. So she comes back to an England which is very different from the kind of Englishness which she had in mind. And we'll talk about that in more details later, the different kinds of Englishness in Look Back in Anger, the different kinds of Britishness in Look Back in Anger. So first of all, let's focus on the principal character, the protagonist in Look Back in Anger, who is Jimmy Porter. So Jimmy Porter, we are told, is a 25-year-old man. So he is a disconcerting mixture, and mark the words, these are very, very important words, and I hope you're reading it from the book as I'm telling you this. He's a disconcerting mixture of kindness, tenderness, and freebooting cruelty, right? So, at the very beginning of the play, we get to know that Jimmy is a very, very complex person. Complex, why? Because he's a disconcerting mixture. It's a very unsettling kind of a mixture of contradictions. So he's a construct of contradictions in some sense. So he's very tender, very kind, and also mercilessly cruel. He's almost a sadist at certain occasions, and he's like a child, an affectionate child on certain other occasions. So he keeps combining all these different attributes, which makes him such a complex character in the first place. And I believe I did mention at some point in my previous lecture that there are critics, there are some very interesting scholarship, which have compared, who have compared Jimmy Porter with Hamlet. Because there are some commonalities we can observe in both the characters, and both of them have a very similar kind of attitude towards women. Both of them are very, very neurotic. Both of them are very, very repressed in their own ways, and both of them are romantics who can't bring themselves on to enact their actions. Okay, so Jimmy Porter too, like Hamlet, is trapped in a social and cultural situation. So Look Back in Anger, at the very beginning of the play, will give you the idea, the feeling of claustrophobia. So you get to know Jimmy's, one-bedroom apartment in the Midlands, which is very, very claustrophobic. It's inhabited by 3 people, so there's hardly any privacy of people. They can't afford a better house, they can't afford a more open, place to live in. So that particular house itself becomes a metaphor for claustrophobia, cultural claustrophobia, right? So it's a kind of place which stifles you. It's the kind of place which doesn't allow agency, doesn't allow expression. right? So that's the kind of place where the action happens. So Jimmy Porter, the protagonist, is a disconcerting mixture of tenderness and freebooting cruelty, right? Of malice and kindness, of absolute sincerity and absolute, malice. So, he's a kind of person who is extremely complex and extremely, is a mixture of opposites in a certain sense. And that's what makes him such a difficult person to analyze, and equally a difficult person to live with, as we find in the course of the play. So, we get to know that absolute sincerity or blistering sincerity like his makes few friends. So his kind of sincerity is blistering, it's absolutely unequivocal, it's absolute. He has no half measures, it's either all or nothing. And he's the kind of person who makes very few friends. So he's the kind of person who will antagonize people very, very quickly, because he is someone who doesn't mince words, he's someone who's directly expressive, he's someone who doesn't equivocate, so someone who's absolutely clear in his articulation, in his malice, in his kindness, in his tenderness. So everything about him, whether it's a positive attribute or a negative attribute, everything about Jimmy Porter is absolutely straightforward and assertive. So that's the first thing we get to know about him, the assertive quality of Jimmy Porter. He's someone who doesn't mince words, right? So he, interestingly, as you find in the play, the first scene we have in the play is two men sitting in a sofa reading newspapers, right? That's the first picture we get, the first image we get as the curtains go up. So two men sprawled on a sofa reading newspapers, the faces are covered with newspapers, and the two men obviously happen to be Jimmy Porter and Cliff, his best friend. So, the play opens with this particular scene, with this particular image, and we get to see, more and more details as the curtains go up and as the directions, directors too. So we get to see that Jimmy Porter is, smoking a pipe, which is again very, very interesting. And I'll come back to the signifier of the pipe in a bit. He's also wearing a very shabby and almost torn tweed jacket. So, the tweed jacket and the pipe, they're signifiers of what? They're signifiers of class. They're signifiers of educated, elitist kind of an Englishness, right? Now, this is something which is very, very interesting because, one of the things which we'll remember as we do this particular course is that no studies and no school of criticism can exist alone. So when you're looking at Look Back in Anger as a gender studies play, as a masculinity or a femininity play, it's absolutely impossible that, we divorce the class component of the play, that we divorce the social component of the play. This is a play which is also, absolutely embedded in the struggle of class, in the location of class, in the politics of class and class identifications. So we have Jimmy Porter, who is supposedly an angry young man, who is this working class hero, who once supposed was a working class hero, but at the same time, he is wearing a tweed jacket, which is traditionally worn by the elite of England, and he's smoking a pipe. So the pipe and the tweed jacket become metonymic markers. You know what metonymic markers are. So these are little bits which indicate a bigger picture, right? So for instance, you can talk about, the spectre indicating royalty, or the gun indicating power, authority, or whatever, right? So, the tweed jacket and the pipe that Jimmy is smoking, they become metonymic markers of his aspiration towards a certain kind of class. So he's aspiring, sartorially at least, he's aspiring to elevate himself into a certain kind of class location, but at the same time, he wants to pose as a working class hero. So immediately, we have different markers of masculinity coming in. So in contrast to that, we have someone called Cliff, as I mentioned earlier. Now, Cliff is someone who's obviously more straightforward, someone who's more direct, someone who's less complex than Jimmy. So he's someone who is in your face, he is unequivocally ignorant, he's completely disconnected with the world. So he's someone that Jimmy can bully at will. So he's someone Jimmy can feel superior to, compared to him. So some people have compared, certain scholars have compared Cliff with Horatio. So again, this Hamlet-Horatio dynamic, if you remember, so Hamlet being this neurotic, extreme, repressed, masculine self, and Horatio being the calm counterpoint to Hamlet. So we have a similar kind of dynamic being replicated and Look Back in Anger to a certain extent. So we have Jimmy Porter, who is this neurotic, mixture of all kinds of opposites, a disconcerting mixture the dramatist tells us. And in contrast to that, we have Cliff, who is this unequivocally lazy, ignorant, someone who is sort of a very nice, affectionate person, someone who's uncomplicated, way uncomplicated compared to Jimmy. So we have these two men at the very opening of the play, and they are sort of sitting together, smoking. Jimmy is smoking a cigar, a pipe, sorry, and they're reading newspapers. It's a Sunday morning, and the location of Sunday is very, very important. So it's a Sunday morning, and all the two sit together and read newspapers and pass the time away. Now, the first line that we get to see, the first dialogue which is spoken in Look Back in Anger, is Jimmy Porter putting the paper down and saying, another Sunday, right? Another Sunday gone. And this is an example, this is an expression of inertia, an expression of tiredness and exhaustion. So he's a person who's essentially trapped in his times. So he's someone who's trapped between one Sunday and another Sunday, where he ends up doing nothing. And he says, our youth is going away, our youth is slipping away. So again, we get this feeling of exhaustion, this feeling of enervation, this feeling of being completely liquidated by time. So he's someone who cannot occupy the dominant marker of masculinity anymore, right? So the two men in Look Back in Anger are very different, obviously. Jimmy Porter, who's aspiring to be the dominant masculine person, who's aspiring to be the working class hero, while at the same time aspiring to elevating himself into some kind of a educated elite person. So he's an educated elite working class hero, which is not so much of a contradiction if we look at the political reality around us today. So the people who aspire to be working class heroes end up looking very, very posh and elitist, and we see that happening all the time around us, closer to home, etc. Right? So we get that picture and Look Back in Anger in the 1956 play, which in a way makes it very, very prophetic, politically prophetic. Right? So now, after the two men are described by the dramatist, we get to see for the first time the woman in the play, Alison Porter, or Alison Redfern. So Alison obviously is very, very, she's described as someone who's very, very beautiful, someone who's elegant, and interestingly, she's wearing one of Jimmy's shirts. Now, one of the things which we should be very careful about in Look Back in Anger is the sartorial symbolism in the play. So what do I mean by sartorial symbolism? The kind of dresses people wear in this particular play, and what is the symbolic significance of the dresses people wear. So at the very beginning of Look Back in Anger, we get to see Alison wearing one of Jimmy's shirts. But the description tells us immediately after that she still manages to look quite elegant in it. Now what does that tell us? That she is wearing Jimmy's shirt. So in a way, she becomes a possession of Jimmy. So she doesn't really have a shirt of her own. She doesn't seem to have at least, something, a dress of her own. So she is wearing Jimmy's shirt. So she's essentially imprisoned by the construct of Jimmy, by the masculinity of Jimmy. But at the same time, the direction also tells us that she still manages to look quite elegant in it. And the word elegant over here is very, very interesting, because elegance obviously is anti-working class. It's not something which you associate with working class people. It's something which is almost sometimes derogatively and pejoratively associated with elitism. So elegance and elitism sometimes go hand in hand. So the fact that Alison still manages to look elegant despite wearing Jimmy's shirt tells us a lot. It tells us, A, that she's sort of a possession of Jimmy in a sense, but at the same time, she still manages to retain her sense of individuality, because remember, as I just told you, she's someone who grew up in India. She's someone who has a very posh imperial background. She's someone who's very used to being waited upon, etc. So elegance is something which comes naturally to her. Right? So it's like a glow to her. It's like something that she is used to being from the very childhood that she has had. So the fact that she still manages to look very elegant despite wearing Jimmy's shirt tells us something about her location. Now, when we see Alison for the first time, we see her ironing on an ironing board. She's a pile of clothes that she's ironing, and there's an ironing board. Now, it's very important that we look at the symbolism and Look Back in Anger. So one of the very first symbols which are given to us is the ironing board. There are many symbols in the opening direction, but the one we're focusing on at the moment is the ironing board of Alison. The place, the board where she puts the pile of clothes and irons all day. And she seems to be ironing almost the entire day. And we don't seem to see her doing anything else apart from ironing the dresses of Jimmy and Cliff. Now, the fact that she doesn't do anything, the fact that she is sort of reduced to ironing a pile of clothes, which are basically the clothes of the men, tell us something about the condition of Alison Redfern and Look Back in Anger. So again, if you look at the transition from being a posh, elite, imperial woman into becoming the wife of someone who runs a street stall and spending the entire day ironing clothes in an ironing board, ironing clothes of men and ironing boards, and tell us something about that. Tells us something about the deflation of the woman, the fall of the woman, and look back in anger. She doesn't really seem to have much of an agency, financial or otherwise. She doesn't really speak much. She's spoken to almost entirely. And again, if you remember what we did when we studied Shatranj Khilari or the chess players, we had a similar situation about the woman in Shatranj Khilari or the chess players, where we have the wives of the two Nawabs, Mir and Mirza, the Begums of the two Nawabs. They are obviously seen to be much more intelligent, much more intuitive than the men, but obviously they're imprisoned by the times. They're the prisoners of the times, the prisoners of the values of the times, so they can't really do much about it. Now, the situation is a little different in Look Back in Anger, but despite that, we see Alison Redfern, just standing on the ironing board and ironing all day, and that's something which is a bit of a tragedy of the woman in Look Back in Anger, although things do change subsequently in the play. Now, at the beginning of the play, when the stage directions are coming into place, when they're being sort of exfoliated in front of you, we get to see a symbolism. There are many symbols in the first 2 pages in Look Back in Anger. And one of the many symbols which we'll see in Look Back in Anger is a teddy bear and a squirrel, a toy squirrel, a toy teddy bear and a toy squirrel. So the two toys in Look Back in Anger, they become extremely symbolic in the play. And we get to know, at the end of the play, they come back with renewed symbolism, with renewed richness of symbolism, which, are there and Look Back in Anger. But at the moment, what we ask to notice the two toys. The tattered toy, both the toys are tattered, the teddy bear and the toy squirrel. So they are there. So it's like a little bit of an unholy cacophony. And that expression comes in the play. It's used by the dramatists and certain points in the play. It's a very unholy cacophony, a very complex cacophony of toys, torn toys, torn furniture, exhausted men and women sitting together in a very small apartment in West London. So that's basically the setting in Look Back in Anger, and you get to see the claustrophobia, the stagnation, the lack of action in Look Back in Anger, which is obviously reflective of the lack of political agency, the lack of political action in Look Back in Anger, which determines the gender locations in the play. Now, if you go back to the very beginning of this course, when we're talking about the critical theory, with the critical terms which are using in this course, one of the terms which you used quite extensively was performativity, right? We talked about performativity as performance, which is designed to generate an effect. So the effect could be awe, wonder, surprise, fear, love, adulation, a combination of all these in different degrees, etc. Now, performativity is a very, very important factor in Look Back in Anger. Now, at the very beginning, we know this is a play, so it's been performed. These are people on stage who are acting out certain roles. But even within the play, we have several instances of performativity where Jimmy wants to become something. The character Jimmy Porter wants to become something else. So we saw at the very beginning, at the very opening of the play, how we see him for the first time wearing a tweed jacket and smoking a pipe, reading newspapers. And that picture, if you picture that in your mind, if someone is wearing a tweed jacket, smoking a pipe, and reading newspapers on a Sunday morning, and that isn't really your typical picture of a working class person, is it? So that is something which you associate more with a genteel person, with someone who's been to university, someone who's posh, someone who's educated, someone who's elite, right? So Jimmy Porter, at the very beginning of the play, ironically appears very, very elitist. So he's someone, who's reading a newspaper, the Sunday newspapers, and then of course he's wearing a jacket which is normally conventionally worn by university people, academics, and white-collar people, and then of course he's smoking a pipe, which again is symbolic of his aspiration to appear elitist, appear gentle, appear as a posh person. Now, interestingly, the rhetoric in Look Back in Anger is very, very gendered. So, we talked about at the beginning of the course how sometimes language can be a very, very gendered entity. So Look Back in Anger uses language in a very gendered kind of a way. It's a language of violence in Look Back in Anger. If you read the play, it's a very angry language. It's a language directed against the woman. So the language is very, very male in Look Back in Anger. And women in Look Back in Anger are targeted with the violence in language. So the rhetoric of Look Back in Anger is a rhetoric of rage, a rhetoric of anger, which is directly targeted towards the woman. And that makes the play really, really interesting and complex, especially in relation to gender studies. Okay, and we have lots of swear words in Look Back in Anger, almost entirely directed towards the woman. The body of the woman is attacked verbally in Look Back in Anger, rhetorically in Look Back in Anger. So again, the woman in Look Back in Anger is an object to be attacked, an object to be possessed, an object to be, invaded by the men in Look Back in Anger. So it's a very, very typical masculinist kind of an enterprise in Look Back in Anger. But what makes it more complex and interesting is how this entire masculinity enterprise is essentially castrated. It's essentially impotent. Is powerless completely. So we saw when we read The Fly by Catherine Mansfield, if you remember the short story which we read, it's essentially a story about deflation. So the story opens with a huge masculine ego, the boss sitting very, very regally in the sofa, and then the story progresses. We see him getting less and less important, more and more weak, and the story ends with him shivering and struggling to remember what he had been thinking about when the story opens. So, again, that particular story is a very classic case in point of a gradual decrease in masculine virility, masculine strength, masculine power, right? So we Look Back in Anger, there are attempts to assume the powerful position. There are attempts to assume that dominant hegemony position by the man. And that obviously comes at the cost of the woman. So Jimmy Porter is consistently and constantly attacking his wife verbally, attacking his mother-in-law verbally. So the body of the woman in Look Back in Anger is mercilessly attacked by the man verbally, rhetorically, and almost becomes visceral. So it's entire relation between the verbal and the visceral and Look Back in Anger. You know the meaning of visceral. It's something related to the body, to the veins. You can actually feel it through the body. So language, the verbal attack in Look Back in Anger become visceral in the quality. And that is obviously part of the gender studies which we'll do in Look Back in Anger, how the language is so male in Look Back in Anger, and how the receiver of the language is female. So that's something that you could expect a question on in the context of this particular drama. The language in Look Back in Anger. It's a very male, phallic, educated language which is used, manipulated, and so constructed to become a device to attack the woman with, right? And the woman's body becomes open for attack, open for slaughter with this particular verbal, visceral language that Jimmy Porter uses. Now, having talked about the language in Look Back in Anger, and obviously this is an issue which will keep coming back in the play as we read in more details, but for the moment, let's go back to the symbols in Look Back in Anger. So we saw at the very beginning, this was an Edwardian house with Edwardian windows with a Victorian slant to it, but now it's essentially part of a council flat, perhaps. It's a kind of place where not very wealthy people live. In post-1947 England. So we see the transition, the economic transition through the architecture of England, right? The architecture belongs to our past. The house is perhaps built at some point during prosperity, but now it stands in the middle of a very impoverished England which can barely make its ends meet. And that's something which tells you something. The very architecture of the house tells you something about the cultural and economic condition in the play. Now, Jimmy Porter, as I mentioned, represents a very complex kind of masculinity. So if you look at the gender studies and Look Back in Anger in terms of the characters, you find immediately Jimmy Porter is someone who is a university educated man who aspires to be an intellectual, aspires to be a genteel intellectual, but he knows he doesn't have the financial resources to become it, so he ends up running a street stall. In other words, he doesn't have the financial capital to become a gentleman, to become something, a force to reckon with in the masculinist political map. So what does he have? He uses his cultural capital. So he's been to university, so he speaks in a certain kind of way, he speaks in a certain kind of language, he uses that language to his great service in order to attack the woman, in order to become something, in order to seduce the people around him. So language becomes a commodity in Look Back in Anger. And mind you, when I use the word commodity in Look Back in Anger, so we talked about commodity in George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant, where everything was a commodity. The elephant was a commodity, the white man was a commodity, the action of the white man was a commodity, which has all been consumed by the Burmese people around him. So in a very similar way, language becomes a commodity in Look Back in Anger, in the sense that Jimmy Porter, with his tweed jacket and pipe and his jazz and his Sunday newspaper and his very, very educated language full of metaphors and references and allusions, he is aspiring to become something that he cannot be because of his financial constraints. So in other words, he doesn't have the financial agency to be a powerful white man in England because the country itself is on its way out in terms of its resources. So he cannot really be a powerful person anymore, though he aspires to be it. Now, in complete contrast to that, we saw Cliff Lewis in Look Back in Anger, who doesn't have any aspiration to become powerful. So he's someone Alison, Jimmy's wife, can be very comfortable with. So Jimmy's wife and Cliff, although they have a very complex relationship, more often than not, we see them in a very comfortable exchange with each other. They're talking to each other in almost in terms of confessions, almost in terms of taking each other into confidence, etc. Now, we find, as I mentioned, Look Back in Anger as a play which is deeply political because it belongs to an era where there's no dominant masculinity left in England. So the two dominant schools of masculinity in Look Back in Anger, there could have been the dominant schools of masculinity. One was imperial masculinity, which is now on its way out because the very phenomenon, the very process, the very existence of imperialism is gone, disappeared after 1947 and this is 1956. So there's no imperial masculinity left in England, and in other words, in another sense, there's no masculinity which has come to replace it. So one can't look at Jimmy Porter as a replacement of imperial masculinity. So he's not someone who's going to step in and become the next hero, because he cannot. He doesn't have the resources. He's not allowed the resources to become the hero in 1956 England, right? So I think I did mention the significance of the play in terms of the cultural condition, because remember, this was a play which is, the setting of the play is post-1944. And 1944 is important because 1944 was the time of the Education Act in England, which essentially allowed free education, free university education to all boys and girls in England, which is why someone like Jimmy Porter, someone with his working class background, could go to a university and graduate from a university, because in normal circumstances, someone like him could never step into a university because it would cost him a fortune. He never can become a university graduate. He never could become a university graduate without the help of the Education Act. The Education Act changed everything. So, it allowed people like boys like Jimmy Porter, to get into university, get a degree, get out with a degree, and obviously come with some kind of a cultural capital. So that was quite good. But what is not so good, and what makes the play more complex, is a failure of the act. Because, post-university graduation, post a degree from the university, these boys and the girls, these men and women, they found themselves essentially jobless. So what's the point in having a university degree if that doesn't guarantee you a job, if that doesn't guarantee you any profession? So Jimmy Porter ends up running a sweet store, which is something which he would have done if he just stayed working class. But he did not stay working class. He got into university, got a degree, came out of the university, and then found himself getting back in the working class again, running a street stall again, because he didn't have any option left. Now, obviously, he cannot do that anymore because he's been to university. He talks in a particular way. So, in other words, he's been corrupted by culture. So, culture has corrupted him in the sense that, he's someone who is in the middle of nowhere. He's in no man's land. He can never be a pure working class person. Or in other words, he can never be a real working class person. And in a very similar way, he can also never become a pure posh person, a pure genteel person, a pure gentleman, because he doesn't have the financial resources to become a gentleman. He's always going to be a no man's land. So in a very interesting way, Look Back in Anger can be seen as a production of a no man's land. So this generation of Jimmy Porters, which is a generation of this Education Act in 1944, they found themselves completely disillusioned, completely cynical about the entire political system or the entire education system which characterized England at that point of time. Now, coming back to the specificity of the play, so we saw the opening of the play, the two men sitting reading newspapers, smoking a cigar, a pipe, Jimmy, and then the wife, the woman, ironing a pile of clothes in an ironing board, and all that put together becomes a very interesting, very complex cacophony of human voices. Now, Jimmy Porter, more often than not, he speaks in a rhetoric of rage. He's almost always angry, and his anger, as I just mentioned, is almost always directed at the woman, the body of the woman. He gets quite vulgar sometimes. He talks about the genitalia of the woman. He talks about the body of the woman in very, very visceral, violent metaphors, especially when it comes to talk about his mother-in-law, and all that becomes quite political because that is reflective of his powerlessness. That's reflective of his fear of being castrated by the woman, the fear of being impoverished by the woman. So he's someone who cannot accept that fear. He's someone who cannot accept that neurosis, and that neurosis makes him even more mad. That neurosis makes him even more, hysterical. And I'll talk about hysteria in a bit and Look Back in Anger, because it's very important to locate hysteria and Look Back in Anger. Because remember, hysteria conventionally was a female malady, was something which happened only to women, according to medical science of the time, the pseudoscience, I mean. And obviously, all that changed after the two world wars. we got to know, the people came to know, everyone came to know that men could be equally hysterical, men could equally have nervous breakdowns, perhaps more spectacularly than women. And Look Back in Anger is essentially about male hysteria. So in a very interesting sense, hysteria is reconfigured in Look Back in Anger. It's regendered in Look Back in Anger. So the most hysteric person in Look Back in Anger turns out to be his male protagonist, Jimmy Porter. Someone who aspires to be the working class hero despite having very, very middle class aspirations. So he's someone who sort of in a way represents the ineffectual intellectual in post-1947 England, someone who's all he has is rhetoric, all he has is a language of rage, a language of cynicism, a language of dissolution. He never does anything real, he never steps out and does anything which is quite substantial. So all he does is sit in his armchair and scream at the world. So he becomes a metaphor, a symbol, a very, very graphic symbol of the ineffective or ineffectual intellectual in post-1947 England. And that again tells us something about the masculinity crisis in Look Back in Anger. So the entire intellectual male, and the entire machismo of the intellectual is essentially castrated in Look Back in Anger. Right? So when we come to the woman and Look Back in Anger, the first woman obviously which we get to see in the play is Jimmy's wife, Alison. And as I just mentioned, Alison is someone who's almost an Anglo-Indian. She grew up in an imperial India, so she's very she's very sort of used to being waited upon, and now she comes back to England and finds herself to be surrounded by people who don't really care about her so much. And the entire marriage of Jimmy and Alison becomes a bit of a class revenge, as we get to see in the course of the play. So Jimmy marries Alison almost as a form of revenge. It's a revenge of the working class, targeted towards the middle classes. Because, and again, look at the way how the entire revenge happens through the female, which is a very historical way of avenging. If you look at all the old stories and ancient myths and histories, you look at the Trojan War, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana. So all revenge stories happen mediated by the female. So it's the woman becomes a trophy, the female becomes a trophy for which the men compete with each other, and she becomes a complete object. She is completely objectified and commodified completely in order to become a prized possession of the men. So the men fight for the woman, the men sort of avenge on each other through the woman, and the agency of the woman is never really articulated in most occasions. So over here, Look Back in Anger, we find Alison Redfern, this very middle-class conventional woman. So she's someone who's seduced by the extravagant, the charm of Jimmy Porter, someone who's universally educated, someone who's been to university, someone who speaks a certain kind of language, someone who has this very seductive rage, this very seductive anger, which is directed against the world, against establishment, etc. And that is very, very seductive, and she falls for it. And because she falls for it, she ends up marrying Jimmy Porter, despite the colossal disappointment of her family, despite the grievances of her family, despite the fact that the family never wanted this marriage to happen. So Jimmy Porter takes up Alison as a prize trophy wife and Look Back in Anger. And that becomes a very, very disturbing, unsettling kind of a relationship between the two, because the two of them, they have this very, very complex and intense love-hate relationship, which we see in Look Back in Anger. That's something which is accentuated with the arrival of the other woman in Look Back in Anger, who's Helen Charles, who comes in later. Now, Cliff Lewis, in the context of this play, Cliff Lewis, who is Jimmy's friend, perhaps his best friend, is someone who lives with them, and he is someone who is inadequately, quote-unquote, inadequately masculinist. So he's someone who is not as, quote-unquote, masculine as Jimmy Porter, but at the same time, he's not someone who is as hysterical as Jimmy Porter. So he's described in the play as a very common no man's land between the two warring territories. So if Jimmy and Alison are seen to be warring territories because they are enemies in terms of class, in terms of upbringing, in terms of value systems, so Cliff can be seen as a very passive and comfortable no man's land between them. So what I'm trying to say is, in this particular drama, Look Back in Anger, the entire idea of gender is completely reconfigured. So in a way, Jimmy Porter is biologically a male. but in a way, culturally, he's essentially emasculated. So he's someone who feels threatened all the time. He's someone who feels attacked all the time. So he's someone who becomes hysteric. And hysteria, as I mentioned, is traditionally an attribute of the female. Conventionally, in a very sexist kind of a way, is an attribute of the woman. And medically speaking, it used to be seen till the late 19th century to be a female malady, something that happens with people who have wombs. So only women have wombs, so only women could become hysterics. Jimmy Porter, in this sense, becomes a hysteric man. So in a way, his masculinity in Look Back in Anger is constantly questioned. And he wants to articulate it, he wants to overcompensate for this with his anger, with his very violent rhetoric, with his visceral violent rhetoric, and with his disillusion, with his cynicism against the world. But obviously, it's a failed project. So the entire project of Jimmy to pass off as this disillusioned, angry young man, a working class hero, falls on his head. He's never going to be a working class hero because he's been corrupted by education. He's been corrupted by culture, by class, to a certain extent. So he quotes Wordsworth all the time, he quotes Shelley all the time, he quotes Emily Bronte all the time, he quotes William Shakespeare all the time. In other words, he has access, he has consumed this high culture. And once it's consumed this high culture, once it's been seduced by this high culture, he cannot come back and become a pure working class man again. So interestingly, there's a section in the very first act in the play where Cliff Lewis proposes that the three of them go out to watch a film, a Sunday evening film, running in the neighborhood in a cinema hall, to which Jimmy Porter replies a response saying, "Oh no, I don't want my Sunday evening to be spoiled by the yops in the front row." Now yops, Y-O-B-S, yops in the front row, that's a very, very pejorative statement, because yops essentially mean unemployed working class men, right? So people who are essentially unemployed, people who are troublemakers, people who are, the bad guys in the street, and because the bad guys, they're automatically assumed to be working class people, because the bad guys, they're automatically assumed as unemployed young men. So that's the kind of stereotypical idea of working class hooliganism in England. And yops in this particular context is a metaphor for that kind of a working class hooliganism. Now, interestingly, this word is spoken and articulated by someone who aspires to be a working class hero, who aspires to be someone who hates the middle class, who hates the establishment, who hates the entire idea of entitlement and privilege around him. But at the same time, he cannot bring himself down to socialize with the truly working class men, because as I just mentioned, he's someone who's been corrupted by education. So once he's been corrupted by education, he cannot go back and become a pure working class man again. So what I want you to observe over here is this very intimate and complex relationship between gender and class. It is something which you see both in Jimmy and Alison Redfern. Alison, mind you, was born into class, was born into a very middle class, privileged, class of entitlement. So she grew up entirely in India. She, as just mentioned, she was so used to being waited upon, so she's way used to this entitlement around her. And that kind of a class structure, that kind of a class construct defines her gender identity, and that's something she can never get rid of, despite wearing Jimmy's shirt. So she's wearing Jimmy's shirt, but at the same time, she still manages to look elegant in it. So that itself shows you that her femininity is defined by the class, and that class is never going to go away. That class is always going to stay, because that class is something which she was born into. In contrast to that, if you look at Jimmy Porter, he was born in a working class household. So he's not someone who's born into privilege, far from it. So he grew up, in not a very posh or privileged childhood. As a matter of fact, we get to know that he had a very traumatic childhood due to the death of his father, which he witnessed on a very close distance. So he saw his father dying in front of him for months and months altogether, and that sort of informed his trauma and to a certain extent his misogyny. But he subsequently had been to a university because of the Education Act, so that made university education free for everyone. So Jimmy Porter went to university, one of the new universities in England which came up after 1944, not the old red brick buildings, but one of the polytechnics which were turned into universities later on. So he went to one of those places and then graduated with a degree, but then he ended up not doing anything substantial. What that entire thing did to him was mix up his gendered location, his gendered identity with his class identity. In other words, his class identity is now completely confused. He doesn't quite know where to belong. He can't go back to become a working class man again, but at the same time he keeps hating. He has a deep-seated hatred against the middle class people, but at the same time he's dressed up in a way which is, symbolically aspiring to become a middle class gentleman. He's wearing a tweed jacket, smoking a pipe, reading the Sunday newspapers. The News of the World is a newspaper he's reading, which we find in the very opening of the play. So all these News of the World newspaper, the cigar, the pipe he's smoking, the tweed jacket is wearing, the Wordsworth is quoting, the Shakespeare is quoting, all these taken together, that this defines his masculinity, but through the prism of class. So the prism of class never quite goes away. And again, this is a very good example of how, and hopefully this will be a training for you, to look at how different perspectives can and should be combined together for a holistic understanding of a play. So if you look at a complex play like Look Back in Anger, we can't just say we're going to do a masculinist reading of Look Back in Anger. Are we going to do a feminist reading of Look Back in Anger? Are we going to do a gender reading of Look Back in Anger without taking into consideration the colonial reading, without taking into consideration the Marxist reading, the class reading, the cultural reading? So all these things are put together, all these things are combined, they're all interrelated. They don't come at the cost of each other, they complement each other. Substantially. So it's absolutely imperative for students and researchers like us to be aware of these different entanglements of different schools of criticism which we see around us all the time. And the best way to read a text is to blend all these perspectives and to make it a really rich reading. So the first act in Look Back in Anger is almost entirely spent in Jimmy's attacking his wife, and a time comes when the two men begin to fight. There's a mock wrestling thing that Jimmy and Cliff do, and in the process of fighting, in the process of wrestling with each other, they bump into Alison's ironing board, which overturns very symbolically, and that iron, the hot iron, falls into Alison's hand, and that burns his hand to a great extent, which is a physical injury that is caused indirectly by Jimmy's histrionic. So Jimmy's hysterical behavior sort of physically causes, directly causes the physical injury to Alison, at which point Jimmy's tirade of rage stops and he gets out. Alison asks him to get out of the house, and he gets out, and Alison collapses, sits down, and this is where you find this very intimate and friendly relationship between Alison and Cliff, and they seem to be almost like a sibling relationship with each other because they're so comfortable with each other. They open up to each other in ways they can't with other people. And this is the first time in the play we get to know that Alison is pregnant with Jimmy's child. Right? Now Jimmy is away. Jimmy has been driven out of the house, and Alison got furious with him and asked him to leave, and he leaves the house because he realizes he's caused physical injury to Alison. So, but when Cliff is there, sitting beside Alison, bandaging her arm, a burnt arm, this is the point where she tells him that she's pregnant with Jimmy's child. Now, this is a very interesting, again, this is part of symbolism in Look Back in Anger. The child of Alison, a child which she'll never have in the end, a child which will die in the end. Again, a very symbolic death. The absent child in Look Back in Anger is one of the many symbols in the play, right? It's the absence of future, in a sense, in Look Back in Anger. It's a futurelessness in Look Back in Anger. The ineffectual quality in the play, the ineffectual quality of the lives of these men and women, that they'll just go on and become old and die, and there'll be no future to look forward to. And that's the symbolism which is produced by the absence of the child. But that's something which we'll come back to later in the play. But at this point in the play, when things really go out of hand, when Jimmy bumps into Alison and the entire ironing board overturns and she burns the hand with the hot iron, and then he goes out, Jimmy, and then Alison and Cliff have a very comfortable exchange with each other, where she tells him that she's pregnant with Jimmy's child. Now this is a point in the play where things begin to change, because prior to this, we just saw a very monolithic kind of an action, but Jimmy had been attacking Alison endlessly with his tirades, with his attack against the family, against his her posh upbringing, which he hates, attacks against her sense of entitlement. And this is a point in the play where we get to hear of people who don't appear in the play, and that's again a very important issue in Look Back in Anger. There are quite a few characters in Look Back in Anger who are spoken about, but don't really appear in the play. And you can expect a question on that at some point in your assignment. The characters who don't appear in Look Back in Anger, but are very important third-person presences. Now, who are the characters? The first character which we'll get to know, who is mentioned in such circumstances, is obviously Alison's mother. Right, Alison's mother, according to Jimmy, is a very, very abusive woman, and she represents a very abusive middle-class woman who is paranoid about purity, hygiene, familial purity, familial hygiene, because of which she hates Jimmy, and Jimmy hates her back. She's someone who is obsessed with protecting the middle-class privilege that she has enjoyed all her life, and Jimmy hates her naturally for that. Right. The second character who is mentioned, but it doesn't appear in the play, and again a very important character, is Nigel Redfern. Nigel Redfern is Alison's brother. We get to know of him through Jimmy, of course. And we also get to know that he's someone who's running for parliament. In other words, he's an emerging politician. But Jimmy describes him as the most vague person that he's ever known. And he says that if there was a medal called Vagary in the Field, which is obviously a parody of bravery in the field, if there were a medal called Vagary in the Field, Nigel Redfern would be an automatic contender for it, because he's so vague. He doesn't have any clue about the world. He doesn't have any sense of reality about the world. But at the same time, he's on his way to become a politician purely because of his birth, and because he was born into this very, very posh family, very wealthy family, and he's automatically entitled to all these privileges because of this birth. Now, the entire politics of entitlement in Look Back in Anger is very complex, because as you see, class again keeps coming back. And every time we talk about gender, every time we talk about politics, every time we talk about identity, class becomes a constant question, a consistent question. So Nigel Redfern is a very important figure, because he represents the entitlement of class. So he's someone who is automatically entitled or perversely entitled because of his classification. It doesn't really matter whether he's a sufficient male or an insufficient male, whether he has the credentials to be on top of the game in politics or not. This is an England where nepotism is rampant, and Jimmy hates him for it. So he's again a very important character in the play, and among the many characters, among the several characters who are mentioned and Look Back in Anger but don't appear physically in the play, but are talked about. They're very important presences politically and theatrically speaking. So Act 1 is all about Jimmy's getting angry. Act 1 is all about Jimmy talking about his disillusion with the world. Act 1 is Jimmy attacking Alison's family. And we see again the male rage, which is a very disguised form of hysteria. Again, I'll keep coming back to the gendered quality of hysteria and Look Back in Anger. So the rage which you see in Look Back in Anger is actually hysteria. And Jimmy wants to disguise his hysteria as rage. Jimmy is trying to masquerade as an angry man, but actually he's a hysterical man. He's someone who's nervous, he's someone who is repressed, he's someone who's afraid, and he's trying to cover up for all this, overcompensate for all this with his rhetoric of rage, which is very, very manly and masculinist. But beneath all this masculinism, beneath all this manliness, what we actually get to know at the end of the play is a very afraid man, a very scared man, a very hysterical man. And he's very afraid to confront his hysteria because of that. And he wants to cover up with it, with his very, very angry language, which is what happens to Look Back in Anger. Now, at the beginning of towards the end of Act 1 in Look Back in Anger, we get to see the arrival of someone called Helena Charles. Now, Helena Charles is a very important character in Look Back in Anger. So she first appears in the play as Alison's friend. She happens to be a professional actress, someone who's acting in theatre, and she's supposed to be sort of touring London and doesn't have a place to stay. But so she sort of requested Alison to find a place for her, and Alison has asked her to come over and stay with them. Now, we get to know as the play progresses how Helena and Jimmy, they sort of hate each other from the first sight, but they end up becoming each other's lovers. So Helena becomes Jimmy's mistress in the course of the play, and it's a very complicated relationship, very physical, very emotional, but at the same time it's a very complex relationship because it's all or nothing kind of relationship. And again, it's a very important gender studies situation that we can do, the relationship between Helena and Jimmy in the course of the play. But for the purpose, what we need to remember, and I'll conclude with this, when you go back to this idea of performativity, when we are acting in order to produce a certain kind of a persona, when you're acting in order to produce a certain kind of effect. Now, Helena Charles in Look Back in Anger, mind you, is a professional actress. So she's someone who's touring as an actress on theatre. And she comes into the Porter household, she comes into Jimmy Porter's house. Immediately Jimmy hates her. and she hates her back, hates him back. And we have a very important, a very interesting conversation between Helena and Alison, which we'll see. We'll discuss that in great details later. But we'll find in that conversation we'll tell a lot about Jimmy, about Helena, about Alison, and the entire gender location in the play. But she very quickly converts into Jimmy's mistress. So again, the transition, very quick and dramatic transition from pure hatred to pure lust. In the case of Jimmy and Helena, it's very, very complex. It's a sort of a consuming kind of a relationship. They want to consume each other very quickly, and then obviously Alison comes back at the end of the play. She goes away in the middle, and Helena becomes Alison's, Jimmy's mistress, and Alison comes back towards the end of the play, and then Helena just departs, and Jimmy and Alison, they get back together in a very exhausted kind of a way. That's the end of the play. But for the moment, what I'll conclude with this lecture is this conversation between. I'll start this conversation, then we'll probably move on to the next lecture. The conversation between Helena and Alison, the two women talking about this alpha male, the supposed alpha male who actually is a hysterical man. The two women talking about him behind his back, right? So Helena asks Alison the obvious question. So why did you fall in love with someone like him? And how could you fall in love with someone like him? They're completely opposites to each other. To which Alison's response is very, very political, because she says that when I came back from India, I found myself in an England which I could not recognize, which is completely unfamiliar to me. So in that kind of an England, everyone was pretentious, everyone was sort of distant, and I didn't even find anyone who was human. And then, of course, Jimmy Porter crashed into a party I was in. He was wearing a very sweaty jacket. He had cycled into the party, and I found there was a sort of seduction about him because he was so different. He was so other. So the entire attraction that Alison had experienced about Jimmy is an attraction towards otherness. And again, we'll talk about this other man in Look Back in Anger. So Jimmy represented to Alison this other man, this exotic other man. She was bored. She was sort of very disillusioned with the likes of her father, the likes of her brother, who were these pretentiously posh people. Again, the question of class comes in. So the masculinity of Look Back in Anger, the masculinity in Jimmy Porter and Look Back in Anger is defined and mediated by this very complex class position. Because according to, in the eyes of Helena, in the eyes of Alison, he represents this exotic class who doesn't have the financial capital to be posh or privileged, but at the same time has somehow acquired the cultural capital to speak like a privileged and posh person, because he's been to university, he can quote Shakespeare, he can quote Wordsworth, etc. So the entire marriage of Jimmy and Alison could be seen as a marriage which is a very complex entanglement of class and class desire. Right? So the entire play Look Back in Anger, when you look at the gender, location and reconfigurations in the play, you find the masculinity of Jimmy Porter, or the lack of it, is defined by his class relationship, is defined by his class location. Likewise, the femininity of Alison Redfern, who becomes Alison Porter, is defined and determined to a great extent by her class location. So she's someone who can never not be posh, who can never not be upper middle class, who can never not be privileged, right? And the irony, the tragedy of Jimmy Porter is what makes him pathetic. He becomes a pathetic character in the end, not really a tragic character. The pathos of Jimmy Porter is he's been corrupted by culture, he's been corrupted by education, and he can never go back and be a pure working class man again. But at the same time, he can never make the transition into the real posh middle class because he doesn't have the financial capital to do so. So this is the very complex entanglement which we'll look at and Look Back in Anger, and we'll proceed as we move on to the next lecture. But I'll conclude with today by reiterating and reminding you to be very, very cautious and very, very careful about the location of class and politics in Look Back in Anger when we look at a play from a gender studies perspective. And we'll come back in the next lecture. We'll talk about India and how India, the very Anglo-Indian presence in Look Back in Anger, becomes a very complex mixture of nostalgia as well as envy. And that also informs Jimmy's hysteria to a great extent. And we look at the location of the gendered location of India in relation to colonial and post-colonial England. But this concludes today's lecture, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.